Yesterday's prophecies, today's headlines. This is the HAL Lindsay
Newsweek
Report.
magazine recently discovered that there has been persecution of Christians going on around the world. Until now, most mainstream news organizations have concerned themselves with stamping out Islamophobia or publicizing Israeli human rights abuses inflicted on terrorists. But Newsweek published an article by Ayaan Hirsi Ali, a young Somali woman who lives under constant threat of death from an Islamic fatwa issued against her for outspokenness. In the article, she writes about what she calls Christophobia, but a fair-minded assessment of recent events and trends leads to the conclusion that the scale and severity of Islamophobia pales in comparison with the bloody Christophobia currently coursing through Muslim-majority nations from one end of the globe to the other. The conspiracy of silence surrounding this violent expression of religious intolerance has to stop. Nothing less than the fate of Christianity, and ultimately of all religious minorities in the Islamic world, is at stake. Stonegate Institute is a nonprofit organization that researches human rights issues worldwide. It found that intolerance towards Christians continued to grow last year, especially during Christian holiday periods. Over this past Christmas, Stonegate documented the murders of 40 Christians attending a Christmas service in Nigeria. They were massacred by the Islamic group Boko Haram. Boko Haram means Western education is sacrilege. The group fancies itself as the African Al-Qaeda and is devoted to establishing Sharia law in Nigeria. In Iran, the state security of the Islamic Republic ordered local churches to cancel Christmas and New Year's celebrations. Churches in Egypt, Malaysia, and Pakistan also closed during the holidays to avoid attacks. Raymond Ibrahim of the Stonegate Institute wrote, "Around the Muslim world, Christmas time for Christians was a time of increased threats, harassment, and fear, which is not surprising considering that some Muslim clerics maintain that saying Merry Christmas is worse than fornication or killing someone." In countries like Egypt, Iraq, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Saudi Arabia, Christians are often viewed as second-class citizens. Persecution in these countries frequently takes the form of sexual abuse of Christian women and forced conversion to Islam, or unjust enforcement of apostasy and blasphemy laws. The theft of Christians' property and the plunder and burning of their homes is common, as are physical attacks and murder. The Arab Spring may have been a breath of fresh air for the Islamists of the Middle East, but it has turned poisonous for Christians who suddenly find themselves at the mercy of the Muslim Brotherhood. Coptic Christians in Egypt were set upon by their neighbors. Wave after wave of attacks were launched against churches, clerics, and the faithful. When the Coptic Christians launched their own protest demonstration, some were shot down in the streets by the Egyptian security services. More than 200,000 Coptic Christians have fled Egypt for their lives. The United States and its allies liberated Iraq, and in return, Iraq turned on its Christian population. More than 500,000 Iraqi Christians were forced to flee as Iraqi Muslims burned their churches, destroyed their homes, and killed their clergy. While the world closely monitored the fate of Islamic protesters during the Arab Spring, it turns a blind eye to the fate of the Christian population trapped behind the Muslim veil. Christian Solidarity International says that more Christians died for their faith in the 20th century than at any other time in history. Reports indicate that more than 150,000 Christians were martyred last year worldwide. According to the CIA World Factbook and the opinion of most of the rest of the world, the United States is considered to be the world's most Christian country. It's impossible to separate America's founding documents from the Bible that is continually referenced in them. One cannot separate the founders from the prayers they offered on behalf of the nation they were establishing. It's not a coincidence that when it came to enshrining the American Bill of Rights, the very first right the founders addressed was the freedom of religion. The First Amendment begins, "Congress shall make no law establishing religion, nor prohibit the free exercise thereof." The dominant liberal politicians in Washington today do not have a clue as to the context in which the first clause of the First Amendment was formulated, and they completely ignore the meaning of the second clause. In the minds of these men and women with anti-religious biases, the First Amendment basically means freedom from religion. Over the decades, the courts have too often sided with liberals who argue that the First Amendment's reference to Congress includes all of the federal government, right down to a county courthouse in Kentucky. That's why federal bureaucrats and judges feel free to make such sweeping pronouncements and grandiose declarations against any form of religious observance or expression. They've been taught to think the Constitution gives them the power and the responsibility to free Americans from the oppression of religion. They're sorely mistaken. In fact, it's just the opposite. The Constitution protects religion from the tyranny of the government. Under a correct reading of the First Amendment, religious freedom trumps the law. No law can be imposed, and only Congress can write a law. That prohibits the free exercise of religious liberties. That has been the supreme law of the land since the foundation of America. But evidently, President Obama's promise back in 2008 to fundamentally change America includes especially changing the rules wherever religion is concerned as well. The administration recently introduced a provision of its new health care law that mandated all employers to provide insurance coverage for contraception, sterilization, and pharmacological abortion for their employees. That provision had worried Catholics who sought and received assurance from the president while the bill was being debated that they would be exempted. Then the White House announced that there would be no exemptions and that all employers would have to provide contraception coverage. This includes Catholic institutions, superseding Catholic dogma that prohibits using contraceptives. White House spokesman Jay Carney attempted to explain it away by condescendingly claiming that the president's plan strikes the right balance between respecting religious beliefs and increasing women's access to critical preventive health services. But since it didn't strike any balance at all, but instead imposed government rules on a church doctrine, it alarmed a lot more than just the Catholics. It offended anyone of faith who has wondered when the government was going to start dictating doctrine to them. In marking the 39th anniversary of the discovery of a constitutional right to kill one's offspring, that is Roe versus Wade, the president's statement revealed much about his own worldview. As we remember this historic anniversary, we must also continue our efforts to ensure that our daughters have the same rights, freedoms, and opportunities as our sons to fulfill their dreams. The President of the United States portrayed children as a burden rather than a blessing. As a state lawmaker in Illinois, he voted 4 times against legislation to protect the life of a baby that survived a botched abortion. Public opposition to the dictatorial provision imposed by Department of Health and Human Services Secretary Kathleen Sebelius, herself a Catholic, continued to mount until the administration announced it was willing to compromise. In an obvious attempt to limit the election year damage the firestorm has caused, President Obama announced that he will not require the church to provide contraception coverage in its employee insurance packages. Instead, he ordered that the insurance companies must provide that coverage free of charge. It's a clumsy attempt at a sleight of hand. The provision requires that the institution still provide the coverage. They just don't have to pay for it. Does the administration really think we're that stupid? The insurance companies won't pay for it. Their other customers will pay for it through increased premiums, no matter their religious convictions. And, of course, this forces the Catholic Church to violate its conscience simply by providing any health insurance at all. If it complies with the health insurance law, it is complicit in what it believes is tantamount to murder. If it disobeys the mandate to provide health insurance, it is forced by conscience to break civil law. For the moment, the President's compromise seems to include religious organizations that provide social services to non-members, such as religious schools, hospitals, charities, soup kitchens, or universities. Unless, that is, the government later decides that those institutions don't really qualify as a church. Furthermore, the President couldn't prevent his ideology from peeking out from under the covers. In his remarks, he reminded us that it's a lot cheaper to prevent an illness than to treat one, and that free preventive care includes access to free contraceptive care. Is the President implying that a child is an illness that needs to be prevented? But this isn't just about the Catholics. It isn't just about contraception or morning after pills. What the administration is seeking to do is redefine religious liberty as a method of controlling public opinion. There's no other logical explanation. I'll be right back. Folks, you know, the America in which I grew up has been turned upside down. We now live in an America where being gay is a social asset and being Christian is a social liability. Even a casual observer would find it hard to miss the growing isolation of American Christians, who are marginalized and ridiculed at every opportunity. It seems that every week there's another news story about a Christian student who's in trouble for daring to pray, even privately, over his lunch, or seeking to start a Christian club, or wearing a cross, or carrying a Bible. Schools and universities have launched an all-out effort to distance the Founding Fathers, whenever they're even mentioned, from any suggestion that they quoted the Bible, prayed, or declared their dependence on God. History revisionists have pretty much removed anything from history textbooks linking the founders with the Bible. Christianity is presented primarily as a myth and believers as uneducated, unintelligent, or superstitious. In 1989, Time magazine reported an upsurge in the most violent types of crimes by teens. The article went on to say that through television alone, by the age of 16, the typical child has witnessed an estimated 200,000 acts of violence, including 33,000 murders. A major study by Dr. Brandon Centerwall of the University of Washington concludes that exposure to television is related to approximately 1/2 of the homicides committed in the United States. According to the study, exposure to television and other current forms of entertainment are also related to a majority of rapes, assaults, and other acts of violence committed by teens. Yet, how often have I heard in the past that there's no connection between the daily filling of one's mind with violence from movies, television, and now computer games, and then the eventual acting out of that violence? The Bible warns about this connection. Proverbs chapter 23, verse 7 says, "For as a man thinks in his heart, so is he." Jesus also warned that evil actions result from the bad things we bring into our minds and dwell upon. Jesus taught about this when he was called a sinner for eating food without ceremonially washing his hands. Jesus said that eating food without washed hands does not corrupt a man, as the false teachers declared. Do you not perceive that whatever enters a man from outside cannot defile him, speaking of physical food, because it does not enter his heart, but his stomach, and is eliminated? What comes out of a man, that defiles a man. For from within, out of the heart of men, proceed evil thoughts, adulteries, fornications, murders, thefts, covetousness, wickedness, deceit, lewdness, an evil eye, blasphemy, pride, foolishness. All these evil things come from within and defile a man. In this context, Jesus taught that physical things do not defile us, but evil things come from our hearts and minds. It is because of this that the Bible warns, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. Whatever we dwell upon in our hearts is what will dominate us. This is why it is of utmost importance to be born spiritually by receiving Jesus Christ into our hearts and receiving the gift of pardon for which he gave his life to purchase for us. Then the only one who can clean up our heart and empower us to reject the evil things of the world will come to dwell in us. This one is the Holy Spirit of God. He comes to live in us to deliver us from the temptations that come from our old nature and make us grow into our new spiritual nature that loves God. So guard your hearts from dwelling upon the immorality, violence, evil that dominates much of our entertainment today. As the Apostle Paul wrote, "Finally, brethren, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is of good repute, if there is any excellence, and if anything worthy of praise, let your mind dwell on these things, and the God of peace shall be with you." Well, that's it for tonight, folks. Allow the Holy Spirit to control your life and walk moment by moment in dependence upon him. That's the important thing. God willing, I'll see you next week.